Out in the back country, most days are quiet enough to forget how far you are from help. The work is routine, the radios are steady, and the roads stay empty longer than they should. Every so often, though, something slips into that routine that doesn't quite belong. I was working a late-season rotation at a small backcountry ranger cabin in the northern section of Glacier National Park, the kind of post that only stays staffed till the first heavy snow makes the access road unreliable. And by mid-October, it was usually just me, a propane heater that clicked on too often, and a radio that worked when it felt like it. So most of my days were spent checking trail conditions, updating the permit board nailed outside the cabin, and driving a short loop twice a day to make sure no one had pushed past the seasonal closures. And that afternoon I noticed a vehicle I hadn't logged before. A dark green pickup parked just beyond a bend where the service road narrows, angled slightly toward the trees instead of the turnout like most people would do, with a thin layer of dust over the windshield except for a clean arc where the wipers had been used recently, which didn't make sense because it hadn't rained in 3 days. And when I walked up to it, I saw there was no permit tag on the dash, no gear in the bed, just a folded tarp and a length of rope tucked neatly along the side. So I wrote down the plate in my notebook, circled it once, and figured I'd mention it on the evening check-in. But when I got back to the cabin, the radio was giving me that low, dragging static that usually meant the signal was bouncing off weather moving in from the west, so I logged it manually instead, and went back to splitting a small stack of wood behind the shed. And it was during that, in the middle of a swing, that I heard a short burst of engine noise from somewhere deeper in the trees. Not from the road I'd just come from, but from farther out, like someone starting and then immediately killing an engine, which didn't line up with any mapped access routes in that direction. And I remember standing there longer than I should have, listening, before finishing the chore. Listening, the light started dropping faster than expected under a bank of clouds that rolled in low and gray, flattening everything. And around dusk, I did another sweep, drove past the same bend.
And the truck was still there, but now the driver's door was slightly open, just a few inches, enough that the interior light should have been on if the battery was still good, but it wasn't. And there were fresh prints in the dirt beside it, boot prints, deep and angled, like whoever made them had stepped out quickly and moved off the road without hesitation, heading into a patch of timber that locals avoided because of the uneven ground and old deadfall. So I followed for maybe 20 yards, not far, just enough to confirm direction.
And I saw something that didn't fit. A narrow path cleared just enough to walk through. Not an official trail, more like something used repeatedly over time. And that's when I backed out. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a lost hiker situation. And by the time I got back to the cabin, it was dark enough that the tree line had turned into one solid wall, and the radio still wasn't cooperating. Just fragments of broken transmissions. So I locked the main door, checked the side window latches, and made a note to report it first thing in the morning. But sometime after 9, I heard tires on gravel again, slow, controlled, not coming up the main approach, but circling around the back access spur that leads to the maintenance shed, which no visitor should have known about unless they'd studied the old maps or been out there before. And I turned off the interior light and watched through the narrow gap in the curtain as a set of headlights cut across the trees, low beams, moving deliberately, then stopping just out of sight of the cabin, and they stayed there, engine idling, for long enough that I started counting seconds without realizing it, and eventually the lights went out, but the engine didn't, and I could still hear it, faint but steady, like whoever was out there didn't want to be seen, but wasn't planning to leave either. And that went on for maybe 10 minutes, before everything went quiet at once. No engine, no movement, just the wind picking up and pushing against the cabin walls. And I didn't go outside, not then, not with the radio unreliable and no backup within an hour's party drive. So I stayed put until first light, And when I finally stepped out the next morning, the air had that sharp, clean edge that comes right before the first real freeze, and the truck by the bend was gone. No tire tracks leading back toward the main road, just a set that cut off into the same section of trees where I'd seen that narrow path. And behind the cabin, near the shed, there was a second set of tracks I hadn't noticed before. Partially covered by fallen needles, older than the ones from the night before, like someone had been using that back approach more than once. And when I went inside to update the logbook before heading out to report it, I noticed an entry written on the previous day's page that I hadn't made, just a time, around 14:10, and a short note in block letters that read, "Checked, road clear," even though I'd been the only one assigned to that sector all week. And my own entry from that afternoon was still there below it, written in my handwriting, which meant someone had been inside the bed when I was outside. And they knew exactly what kind of note would look normal if no one looked too closely. I took a seasonal job in southern Utah after a stretch of years doing maintenance work on highways, and the shift to a BLM contact station felt slower at first. Less traffic, more open land, and long hours where the only real task was keeping track of who went out into the backcountry and who actually came back. And by midsummer, I had a rhythm of logging permits, checking water levels at a few remote sites, and doing evening sweeps along a dry wash that people like to hike even though it wasn't marked as an official trail. And the day this happened started with a couple in a rented SUV who seemed overly focused on asking where they could camp without being noticed, which is not how people usually phrase that question. So I gave them the standard guidance and marked their permit with a note to check in on them if they stayed out past their declared return. But what stuck with me wasn't them. It was the way the man kept glancing past me toward the equipment rack behind the station, like he was trying to memorize where things were. And after they left, I stepped outside and noticed a second vehicle parked farther down the access road. An older white van with no plates on the front, just a bracket hanging loose, and I hadn't seen it arrive. Which bothered me more than it should have, because there's only one way in and out of that stretch, unless you're cutting across terrain that most drivers avoid. And when I walked down toward it, the van's windows were covered from the inside with something reflective, not professionally done, just taped up panels that didn't quite fit. And there was a faint hum coming from inside, like a small generator or inverter running. So I knocked once, waited, then knocked again harder, and the hum cut out immediately, but nobody answered. And I stood there long enough to hear my own footsteps settling in the gravel before heading back to the station, writing down what I'd seen in the log and trying to raise the regional office in the radio, which came through in fragments again. Enough to catch a call sign, but not enough to carry a full report. And by late afternoon, the heat had shifted into that heavy stillness where even the insects quiet down, and I decided to do a drive out toward the wash to check for the SUV. But halfway there I found a different set of tracks crossing the road, fresh, deep, from a vehicle with mismatched tires, cutting from the direction of the van toward a restricted service route that leads to an old survey site. And that route is blocked by a locked gate about a mile in, so I followed the tracks until I reached it, and the gate was still closed, but the chain had been looped back through the latch without being secured, like someone wanted it to look locked from a distance, and beyond it I could see the tracks continuing, heading deeper into an area that had no reason for visitors to be in. So I marked the position, took a couple of photos with the station camera, and headed back before sunset because I didn't want to be stuck out there in the dark with a radio that cut in and out. And when I got back, the white van was gone. No sign of it ever being there, except for a faint rectangle in the dust where it had been parked. And that unsettled me more than the tracks, because it meant whoever was inside had left without passing the station, which shouldn't have been possible without me noticing. And I spent the next hour checking the perimeter, making sure the storage shed was locked, counting fuel cans, doing all the small tasks that give you something to focus on when your mind keeps circling back to the same question. And just after dusk, while I was inside updating the permit board, I heard a voice outside call out BLM in a flat, almost rehearsed tone. Not loud enough to carry far, just enough to reach the door. So I stepped out and saw a man standing near the edge of the light from the station's single overhead bulb. Hands visible, posture relaxed. And he said he was looking for directions back to the main highway, because his GPS had failed, which happens often enough out there. But when I asked where he'd come from, he gestured vaguely toward the wash, not the restricted route. And his shoes were clean in a way that didn't match that. Terrain, no dust caked into the seams, no small cuts from the rock. And while we were talking, I noticed his eyes flick once toward the equipment rack again, through the open doorway, the same way the earlier man had. And I gave him general directions without inviting him inside, kept the conversation short, and watched him walk back into the dark where I couldn't see any vehicle lights waiting for him. And after he was gone, I closed up earlier than usual, locked the main door, and tried the radio again, finally getting a partial connection where I managed to report the gate and the vehicle tracks before the signal dropped. And I stayed up longer than I should have, listening. And sometime past midnight, I heard a low mechanical sound coming from the direction of the wash. Not an engine exactly, more like something powered but muffled, running in short intervals. And it went on like that for a while before stopping completely. And the next morning, with the sun already heating the ground, I drove back out to the gate with a clearer signal window and found it open this time, chain hanging loose. And beyond it, the tracks had multiplied, at least 3 vehicles now, all moving in and out of that restricted area, and near the entrance, partially buried under a thin layer of dust, like it had been placed there intentionally, was one of our own permit slips, the kind we issue at the station, filled out in quote, block letters that matched the note I'd logged from the couple earlier, except the date was wrong by 2 days, and the destination listed wasn't anywhere in that direction, and the signature line had my name written on it, not as a signature, just printed cleanly, like someone had copied it from the logbook and didn't quite understand how it was supposed to look. The summer I covered a fire lookout support post in the Bitterroot Range. I wasn't actually stationed in the tower itself, but in a lower elevation supply cabin that handled radio relays, weather logs, and occasional foot traffic from hikers who didn't realize how far they were from anything resembling a road. And the job was mostly about maintaining consistency, hourly check-ins, recording wind direction shifts, keeping the backup generator from stalling when temperatures dipped overnight. And I liked it because the routine made the isolation feel structured instead of empty. But that week in late August, a dry storm system had moved through, leaving scattered lightning strikes and a patchwork of smoldering ground fires that hadn't yet grown large enough to show on aerial reports, which meant we were relying more on lookout sightings and radio relays than usual. And on the second evening of that pattern, I started picking up a transmission that didn't align with any of our assigned call signs. Just a clipped voice repeating coordinates in a steady cadence, always the same set, always ending with a pause that suggested it expected a response, and the coordinates pointed to a drainage about 6 miles east of my position, outside the usual patrol zones, because the terrain there was rough and rarely used except by experienced backcountry crews. So I logged the transmission times, tried to reach the main dispatch to verify if a team had been reassigned, but the signal window kept collapsing into static as the weather shifted again, and by morning, the air had that hazy, metallic quality that comes from distant smoke mixing with heat. So I packed light, left a note in the cabin log about where I was headed, and started up the ridge trail that would give me a partial line of sight into that drainage, figuring I could at least confirm if there was any visible activity before escalating it further. And the hike itself was uneventful in the way that long climbs can be, just the crunch of gravel, the occasional call of a bird cutting across the valley, and the steady awareness of how far you are from the nearest maintained road. But when I reached a point where the ridge opened up enough to see into the drainage, I noticed something that didn't match fire activity at all. A narrow column of darker smoke rising in a straight line from a spot near the base. Too controlled, too consistent. And when I glassed it with binoculars, I could make out a small clearing that wasn't on any of the maps I carried, with what looked like a tarp stretched low between 2 trees and a vehicle partially concealed under branches. And I stayed there longer than I planned, watching for movement. And eventually I saw it. Someone stepping out from under the tarp, moving with the kind of deliberate pace that comes from knowing exactly what made me, where everything is placed, not the hesitant movement of someone in unfamiliar terrain. And they walked over to the vehicle, opened the rear, and pulled out what looked like a handheld radio, held it up. And after a moment I heard the same coordinates again, faint but recognizable, carried up through the valley. And it clicked that the transmission I'd been hearing was coming from here, not from any official unit. And I started to back off the ridge, thinking I'd return to the cabin and push a full report through during the next stable radio window. But on the way down, I noticed a set of markers along the trail that hadn't been there the day before. Small strips of faded orange fabric tied low on branches, not the kind we use for official trail marking, placed at irregular intervals like they were meant to be followed only if you already knew to look for them. And I passed 3 of them before realizing they were leading in the direction of my cabin, not away from it. And that changed the way I moved for the rest of the descent. Slower, quieter, paying more attention to the ground and the spaces between trees. And by the time I got back to the clearing where the cabin sat, the first thing I noticed was the generator shed door slightly ajar, just enough to break the line of shadow it usually cast in the afternoon light, and I was certain I'd secured it before leaving, so I approached from the side, keeping the cabin between me and the main trail. And when I reached the shed, I saw that the latch hadn't been forced, just lifted and set back into place without catching. And inside, nothing obvious was missing. The fuel cans were where they should be, the toolkit untouched. But the generator itself was still warm, even though I hadn't run it that morning, which meant someone had been there recently, using it for a short period. And when I stepped back out, the silence around the cabin felt different, like the usual background sounds had thinned out. And I went inside, checked the radio, and found it already on, tuned to a frequency I didn't use for standard check-ins. And as I reached to switch it back, the same voice came through again, repeating those coordinates, closer this time, clearer, followed by a brief pause, and then, in a tone that didn't match the earlier cadence, a single line. "You don't need to come back down." And I froze for a second longer than uncomfortable admitting before cutting the radio off and moving to the back window, scanning the tree line where the slope drops off toward the trail. And I didn't see anyone, but I did see something else. Another strip of that orange fabric tied to a branch about 30 yards out, positioned at eye level this time, facing directly toward the cabin. And it hadn't been there when I left that morning, and I realized then that whoever was operating out of that drainage had not only found the trail I used, but had already walked it, mapped it, and marked it in a way that suggested they expected to use it again. And when I finally managed to get a stable connection with dispatch later that evening, I gave them the coordinates, the description, everything I'd seen, and they acknowledged it, said they'd send a team out when conditions allowed. But the official follow-up report, a week later, described the site as an abandoned illegal campsite with no occupants found, no equipment beyond basic supplies, and no evidence of ongoing activity, which didn't line up with what I'd watched through the binoculars. And before I rotated out at the end of the season, I went back through the cabin log one last time to make sure everything was documented properly. And on the page, where I'd written my note about hiking up to the ridge, there was a second entry added beneath it, in the same block letter style I'd seen on other reports that summer, listing the exact same coordinates I'd been hearing, but dated 3 days before I ever picked up the first transmission. Most of my career was in state parks, not federal land. So when I took a temporary winter assignment in Great Basin National Park to help cover a remote alpine contact station, I had to adjust to a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes with deep snowpack, closed roads, and long stretches where the only tracks you see are your own from the day before. And the station itself sat just below a tree line. A small insulated structure with a weatherboard out front, and a radio setup that only had a reliable window twice a day when atmospheric conditions lined up. so everything you did out there was planned around those narrow communication slots. And early January had been steady, cold, clear, predictable, until a system moved in faster than forecast and dropped a layer of wind-driven snow that erased most surface detail overnight, which made my morning check more important than usual because I needed to confirm that the marked winter route was still visible for the occasional permitted skier. And as I stepped out just after first light, I noticed a set of tracks crossing the open area in front of the station that didn't belong to skis or snowshoes, just boot prints, deep and uneven, cutting straight across the posted route markers without following them. And they came from the direction of the closed upper road, which had been gated weeks earlier. So I followed them a short distance, enough to see they led toward the tree line where the train drops into a shallow bowl. And then I turned back because visibility was already starting to flatten under incoming cloud cover. And I didn't want to lose sight of the station in case the weather closed in completely. But when I got back to the door, I saw something I hadn't noticed on the way out. A small script mark near the latch. Not fresh wood exposed, just a slight disturbance in the frost pattern, like someone had tested the handle without forcing it. And inside, everything was as I'd left it. The logbook open to the previous day's entry, the radio quiet, the heater cycling on and off with that familiar click, so I logged the tracks, noted the direction, and waited for the first radio window to report it. But when the time came, the signal was weaker than usual, breaking up just enough that I couldn't confirm whether my transmission had been received, which left me in that uncomfortable space of not knowing if anyone else was aware of the situation. And by midday, the sky had gone from gray to that uniform white that removes depth from everything, making distances harder to judge. So I stayed close to the station, clearing snow from the solar panels and checking the backup battery levels. And it was during that routine that I saw movement at the edge of the trees, not clear enough to identify, just a shift against the flat background, followed by a brief flash of something reflective, like glass catching what little light was left. And I watched for a while, expecting it to resolve into a skier or someone moving along the contour, but it didn't. It stayed in roughly the same area, low, partially obscured, and after a few minutes it was gone, or at least no longer visible from where I stood. And I told myself it could have been a branch shifting under snow load, or even my eyes adjusting to the flat light. But when I checked the tracks again later in the afternoon, I realized there were now two sets crossing the route, not one. And the newer set overlapped the earlier prints in a way that suggested someone had retraced the same path, stepping deliberately into the existing impressions, which is something you see in people trying to minimize how obvious their movement is. And that wasn't consistent with a lost visitor scenario. So I made the decision to secure the station earlier than usual, closed the shutters on the windward side, and kept the interior lights low as the storm began to pick up, bringing a steady hiss of snow against the walls that masked smaller sounds. And sometime after dark, while I was sitting at the table going over the nap board to double-check access routes, I heard a faint knock, not on the main door but somewhere along the sidewall. A dull, irregular contact that could have been loose debris in the wind if it hadn't repeated at uneven intervals. And I stayed still, listening, counting the gaps between each sound, and after the third or fourth I realized they weren't random. They were spaced just far enough apart to suggest intention without being obvious. And I moved toward the back window, lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see out into the storm, and for a moment there was nothing but blowing smell. Then a shape resolved near the edge of the cleared area, low to the ground, partially obscured, and I caught the outline of what looked like a person crouched beside one of the route markers, their back turned slightly, as if they were focused on something in their hands. And then the wind shifted, and the view closed again. And I stepped back, not opening the door, not calling out, because the combination of the tracks, the earlier movement, and the way the sounds had been spaced out didn't feel like someone seeking help. It felt measured. And I waited through the night with the radio on low volume, hoping for the morning window, and when it finally came, I got a clear enough connection to report everything. The tracks, the movement, the sounds. and was told to hold position until a team could come up, which took most of the day given the conditions. And when they arrived, 2 of them on snowmobiles, the first thing we did was check the area where I'd seen the figure. But there were no fresh tracks leading away from it, just the 2 overlapping sets from earlier, now partially filled in by drifting snow. And near the base of the route marker where I'd seen the person crouched, we found a small object half buried, a compact mirror, the kind you'd carry in a pocket, its surface angled slightly upward, positioned in a way that would catch light from the station during the night if the interior lights were on. And when we went back inside to document it, I noticed the logbook had shifted slightly on the table, not moved far, just enough that the edge no longer lined up with the grain of the wood the way I always left it. And on the open page, beneath my last entry about the tracks, there was a faint indentation where something had been written and then removed. The paper pressed just enough to leave an impression, and when one of the team members shaded it with the side of a pencil, the words came up in shallow lines that didn't quite match my handwriting. Just 3 short words spaced out across the page. Light stays on. Ah. I was already past 50 when I took a volunteer position in the Everglades, working a remote backcountry check station that sat on a narrow strip of higher ground between 2 long stretches of mangrove and open water. And the job was simple in theory: log canoe permits, keep an eye on weather advisories, and make sure anyone heading into the maze of channels understood how easy it was to lose direction once you were out past the marked routes. But in practice, it meant long, humid days with very little traffic, and nights where the only consistent sound was insects layered over distant water movement. And in early April, just before the real heat set in, we had a run of unusually low visitation, which made the first irregularity stand out more than it might have otherwise. A solo paddler, who checked in late in the afternoon without a reservation, gave a name that didn't match any ID when I asked for it, then corrected himself casually like it didn't matter, and listed a destination that was technically reachable, but required threading through a series of turns that most first-time visitors avoided. And I remember marking his permit with a note to follow up, because his gear looked mismatched: new canoe, older dry bags, and a handheld radio clipped to his vest that wasn't one of the standard models we usually saw from outfitters. And after he pushed off, heading into a channel that narrowed quickly under overhanging branches, I went back to my routine, checked the tide chart pinned inside the station, and made a mental note of the time, because the outgoing tide would make his return more complicated if he stayed out too long. And it was just after sunset when I heard the first motor, which was unusual because that section was restricted to paddle traffic, and the sound was distant, moving slowly, not following the main axis route but cutting across somewhere deeper in the mangroves, where there shouldn't have been enough clearance for anything with an engine. And I stepped out onto the small dock with a flashlight, kept it low, and listened, and the motor cut out after a few seconds, replaced by the soft, irregular splash of something moving through shallow water, and I stood there long enough to feel the air shift as the temperature dropped slightly, bringing a faint smell of fuel that didn't belong. And when I went back inside, I tried the radio, got nothing but a thin band of static, which wasn't uncommon that time of night. So I logged the sound instead, and decided to check the outer marker lights before turning in. And when I walked the short path along the edge of the station, I noticed a second canoe pulled up against the bank where we didn't designate landing, partially hidden by brush, and it hadn't been there earlier. The hull scuffed and dull, no visible registration numbers, just a coil of rope tied loosely to a root, and inside it, a single dry bag that looked heavier than it should have been for its size. The fabric stretched at the seams, so I didn't open it, just noted it, and stepped back, scanning the tree line where the mangroves formed a dense wall of shadow. And I remember thinking that if someone had come in without checking at the station, they either didn't know the procedure or were choosing to avoid it. And neither option sat well given the layout of that area. And I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the interior lights dim. And some time later, I heard a voice carry across the water, low and steady. calling out a name that wasn't the one the paddler had given me, repeating it twice, then stopping. And the silence that followed felt heavier than the usual night quiet, like everything had pulled back at once. And I didn't respond. I didn't step out, because the combination of the hidden canoe, the motor sound, and the mismatched name suggested something I wasn't equipped to handle alone, so I waited until first light. When the channels opened up visually, and the radio signal improved, just enough to reach the main office, and I reported everything. The late check-in, the second canoe, the motor, the voice, and they told me to hold position while a patrol boat came out, which took a couple of hours, and in that time I went back to the bank to check the canoe again, and it was gone. No rope, no drag marks in the mud, just a slight disturbance in the water line where it had been. And when the patrol arrived, we ran the channels in widening loops, found no sign of the paddler, no abandoned gear. Nothing that matched the description of the second canoe, and by early afternoon, the official stance shifted toward a possible navigation error, someone exiting the system at a different point, which happens more often than people think. But when I returned to the station to update the log, I noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. A small mark carved into the wooden edge of the permit board. Not deep, just enough to be deliberate. A set of parallel lines with a short cross cut through them. And it looked familiar in a way I couldn't place until I flipped back through the previous week's entries and saw the same pattern lightly scratched into the corner of two different permit slips, both issued to names that didn't correspond to any follow-up checkouts. And when I checked the timestamps on those slips, they lined up almost exactly with the periods when the radio had dropped out each evening. Which meant, whoever had been moving through that area hadn't just been avoiding the station. They had been timing it around the moments when no one could call anything in,